Hi, everyone. This feels very strange speaking into a screen. And this is my first webinar, so please be patient with me. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. I think will be the easiest. Ooh, not start at the beginning, at the end. Okay, so today's webinar, let me minimize this for you. We are going to be sort of zooming in on the big blue and talking about marine protected areas. So just a couple of housekeeping things. Firstly, this is an interactive presentation, so please do have your phones on standby, and I'll be asking you to use them, or you can use your laptop and look at another page. Obviously, please don't use your phones at other times. And then secondly, I've put this presentation together really as a sort of introduction to marine protected areas. And there's obviously so much information out there and I couldn't cover it all. So please feel free to ask me any questions. I will answer to the best of my abilities, or I will point you towards someone or some resource that might be able to answer you better. And after seeing some of the participants of this webinar, there are actually a few people listening that could probably answer your questions better than me. Okay, so firstly, who am I? Oh, blah. So I am an environmental scientist, and I recently finished my MSc in environmental science, looking into South African MPAs. So I did my master's and all of my university at Rhodes University in Makanda. I grew up in Kenya and I moved to the UK at the beginning of July. So I'm a bit all over the place at the moment, but in a good way, hopefully. So just gonna try and get rid of this waiting room thing. Oh, no, okay. So a quick rundown of what we're going to be talking about. We will start with what is an MPA, and then we'll move on to two sort of main spaces that MPAs occupy and the main sort of threats and pressures that they face. Then we'll talk about some of the different types of MPAs and the management types and zone types. And then we'll talk about some challenges and then some benefits. And then we'll come up with a way of continuing the conversation. So even though this webinar is over, I think that the fact that we've all managed to get together in this setting is really exciting, and I think lots of interesting things could come from this. So the first thing that I would like to do is, before we define an MPA, I would like to know what you guys think of when it comes to marine protection. So we are going to be building a word cloud together. So if you can grab your phones, and if you have Zapper or an iPhone, you can just scan the QR code and that will take you straight to the right page. Otherwise, you can go to menti.com and enter the code that's on your screen, so 7988630. And also one of the facilitators should have sent a link to you in the chat. So all it's going to ask you to do is enter 3 words or maybe short phrases that jump into your mind when you think of marine protection. And now, if you start doing that, we should, once you've submitted them, they should just pop up on here. Hopefully. Yay! Okay, so the more words we get, the bigger the cloud will get, and also certain words, the more that people say them, they'll get bigger. So obviously at the moment we've got endangered is quite an important thing. which makes a lot of sense because we are protecting, and there's a massive number that are of species that are on the red list. Empty, oh, that's a really sad word. Not untrue, but sad. Conservation and sustainability. So these are all holistic, sort of all nice words, sort of bringing out the systems thinking coming in here. I just love watching the cloud change. I'm trying to see if there are any that I'm confused by. The future, I like that one. So we're still the sort of five main themes: ecosystem, endangered, conservation, sustainability, protection. Banned poaching, that's an interesting one. I don't know about you guys, but I find poaching a really interesting topic that's really quite nuanced, and there's been some really interesting work about criminalizing poaching. Yeah, give it a couple more minutes for people to add any more words. Okay, so seems to have stalled for a bit. So we'll leave that there. You will be able to contribute to the word cloud for the next 7 days. So if you don't get to do it now, or if you know someone else, or if you're watching this not on the day of recording, you can still add to this word cloud. And also on the website, this word cloud will be embedded. So you'll be able to check in every now and then and see how it's changed and progressed. Okay, and that's also just a really cool resource that I wanted to share with everyone. Mentimeter, I've used it in a few different scenarios and it's really exciting. So I would definitely recommend using it. Okay, so back to the presentation. So the main question is, what is a marine protected area, or an MPA? And there are lots of different types of MPAs that have different rules and purposes and impacts and stakeholders. So there are actually a few different definitions floating around there, but generally they all have the following characteristics. So they encompass marine areas, they have defined boundaries that include the water column and the ocean floor. They're legally or explicitly protected. They're generally there for a specific feature or system, and they're managed with a higher level of protection compared to their surrounding areas. But for this talk, I'm going to use one of the sort of more popular definitions that tends to be used by lots of researchers and IUCN, sometimes WWF. And there are two parts of this that I would like to point out that I think are really interesting and really pertinent, and that is the MPAs are also there. Part of their reason for being is to help provide ecosystem services, so the benefits we get from the environment, and to serve cultural values. And this is a really special thing that I think, especially, I know that theory's moving a bit, but we live in such a world where we're so worried about what's tangible and what we can pay for with money, that the fact that we've got protected areas that are working towards something that is so integral as cultural values is really something very special. So now I'm going to chat about the two main spaces that MPAs can occupy. So you've got offshore and coastal MPAs. And So an offshore MPA is generally found beyond 12 nautical miles from the shore and beyond maybe territorial waters. And they are generally used to protect highly mobile and migratory species at highly valuable stages of their life cycles by encompassing seasonal breeding or feeding grounds, other aggregation areas, or key parts of their migratory routes, as well as all habitats that are critical to the survival of that species. So they're really covering quite a huge variety of things. And one of the things that they do is they tend to encompass a lot of the deeper ocean, which we don't know that much about, but it's really important to protect. So an example is that of female whale sharks. So the mating and pupping of whale sharks has never been observed in the wild. And intriguingly, up to 90% of whale sharks that pass through the Galapagos Marine Reserve are thought to be pregnant and, well, are female and are thought to be pregnant. And they tend to dive off and go really deep around that marine reserve. And so the BBC tried to follow a pregnant female in this area in their series Blue Planet 2, but their submersible couldn't actually go deep enough. So we still don't know what goes on down there, but we're thinking, well, we scientists are thinking that it's very important. And so by protecting vulnerable areas such as breeding and spawning grounds, this can result in a greater source of larvae and young, which can contribute to the exploited part of a population. It can result in improved breeding success and overall lower mortality, as well as then contributing to more sustainable fisheries, simply because there's more resources. And this is all sort of nuanced. And furthermore, any spatial protection that encompasses biologically significant parts of a large species life cycle is also highly likely to protect some of the highly abundant and diverse communities of smaller pelagic species. And there's a really fantastic, slightly older TED talk called Why You Should Care About Whale Poop that is really exciting and gives a really great example of why these massive species are so important to the existence of microscopic species. And so it's really easy, though, to forget how busy the open ocean is because it's out of sight. And sometimes, unfortunately, it is out of sight, out of mind. But there are huge pressures on the open water. And so offshore has traditionally been exploited by commercial fishing and the oil and gas industries. But the expanding blue economy really exemplifies the growing interest in offshore marine environments. And it reflects a wider range of activities as well. So you've now got marine energy extraction, marine mineral extraction, aquaculture, maritime, coastal, and sort of cruise tourism. And then you've got blue biotechnology. So you've got all of these activities going on that are going to have some form of impact. So on the slides, just to give you a visual idea of some of the impacts that are going on around South African coasts and open water, we've got in the top left all of South Africa's marine protected areas. But then in the three other graphs or figures, we have from the National Biodiversity Assessment of 2018, we've got different pressures, and you can see how they're all quite high intensity, and these are just three of them. This is really just a snapshot. Okay. Oh, no, going back. Sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of this, it keeps popping up. Okay, so now coastal MPAs. So they obviously run along the coastline. But just saying coastal is it's not as clear as you would think. And actually, it really depends on the habitats that are near the coast and the extent to which the MPA will extend into onto land, essentially. So in the 2018 National Biodiversity Assessment, the coastal zone was actually determined ecologically and was identified using as sort of terrestrial and marine ecosystem types with really strong coastal affiliates. And so in this case, estuaries were also designated as coastal. So you can really see that it depends on what the habitat is like as to the range within land or beyond. Now, coastal MPAs do tend to have really high levels of biodiversity, especially in some of the more well-known and highly protected sort of ecosystems and habitats, such as coral reefs, kelp forests, and mangrove forests, all of which are amazingly along the South African coast. And this biodiversity contributes to medicinal and nutritional and other uses. But also what's really powerful in coastal MPAs is its contribution to livelihoods. So you can have livelihoods that are maybe sort of small scale, sustainable, sort of day hand to mouth fishing. You can have commercial fishing, so all scales of fishing, but also you've got lots of different types of ecotourism going on in MPAs. And so coastal MPAs work towards ensuring that people have access to important species, but at the same time, they're there to ensure that the use is sustainable. So really, they've got to think about, and this is one of the great challenges of MPAs, is you've got to think of any protected area and natural resource management, is you've really got to think temporally and into the future and try and understand that. So there are lots of coastal pressures. The ones on the screen are just the top 10 themes that were identified in the National Biodiversity Assessment for South Africa. But generally, MPAs are also designed to address and minimize a lot of these pressures as much as possible, whether it's poaching or the use of destructive fishing gears or development like building and sewage deposits, which may become harmful for the environment. So that's really, MPAs have a lot of work to do and really quite grand objectives. So those are the two sort of big areas that MPAs occupy. And now I'd like to talk about types of sort of managing and governing MPAs. I'm not going to talk about the IUCN categories of MPAs, just because I don't think we have the time, and that's really easy to Google. And, you know, I'm maybe not the best person to talk about that. So I'm going to break down some of the management types. So MPAs can vary depending on the activities that are permitted within the area. So you can have multiple use, which allows extractive uses like fishing, but obviously with some restrictions. So we've got quite a few of those across South Africa, but the one that pops to mind immediately is Table Mountain National Park. You also have no-take MPAs, and these allow people to use the area, but they prohibit any extraction or destruction to the area. And these are also known as marine reserves. So examples of this in South Africa would be Robberg or De Hoek, for example. And then you have no impact MPAs, and this allows people into the area, but extraction, disposal of any pollutants, the installation of materials, the disruption of environment of any kind is not permitted. And while these types of MPAs are quite rare and they are generally associated with research only, one of these examples, or as close to that I can think of in South Africa, is Isimangaliso. Would potentially be one of these, would fit that description relatively well. And then the other activity-based is no access. So basically it restricts all access to the area. These are also very rare and do tend to be associated with research zones. An example of this would be in the West Coast National Park, in the lagoon, there's a certain area that you can't use either at certain times of the day or certain times of the year. You're not allowed to enter, and those who are allowed to enter, it's highly, highly restricted. But often MPAs are a combination of these different activities. So like Table Mountain, there are multiple use zones, but there are also no take zones. So that's, again, it's quite interchangeable. There are also, MPAs can vary in terms of how long they'll be protected. So this can actually also have massive impacts on the success of the MPA and their sort of overall outcomes. So you have permanent MPAs, which are protected indefinitely until maybe a piece of legislation changes it. Then you have conditional MPAs, and these MPAs have the potential to continue into the future, but that is dependent on them obtaining and meeting their objectives. And then you have temporary MPAs that are designed to meet short-term conservation goals, which to me is an oxymoron, but there we go. And this could include closing a fishery down, or it could be linked to cultural practices, and I give an example of this later on. And then MPAs, I hope you're enjoying this slide and studying that picture. Then you get levels of protection changing throughout the year. So you can have MPAs that are year-round standard protection throughout the year. And then you can have seasonal MPAs. And these MPAs that offer protection during specific periods when sensitive ecological processes are taking place, such as spawning, breeding, eating. So again, for example, Table Mountain, sorry, this was my case study, so a lot of my thinking is there. People are allowed to harvest West Coast rock lobster at certain times of the year, and then at certain times they're not. So that's an example of seasonal protection. And then you've got rotating MPAs, and these are MPAs that move between particular geographic areas to achieve short-term conservation goals. And these are really rare, but I do think that there's a lot more discussion coming up around them. And I think it's actually a really exciting way of thinking. And from a social science point of view, it makes a fair amount of sense. Ecologically, I would love to hear other people's opinions. Unfortunately, I'm not an ecologist. Okay, then there are also some MPA management challenges that we can talk about. So these are ones that are linked to management of the MPA itself, or an individual MPA. So obviously there are a lot more, but one of the big ones is capacity and budget. So at the MPA, are there enough people working there? Do they have the right skills? Do they have the right opportunities to upskill themselves? Do they have the right technology that they need to effectively manage and protect this area? And a lot of that actually has to do with budget availability. And that links us onto our next point quite nicely, I think, is corruption. It's a large area. There's so many different needs and things. There's going to be corruption. I feel like it's a bit of a no-brainer that would be a challenge. The types of corruption, that's a whole other thing. And then another huge challenge is the fact that there are so many different groups of people that use MPAs and rely on MPAs for different reasons. And in many cases, they have conflicting needs. So it's up to the design of the MPA, so the placement of different zones and the placement of the MPA itself, as well as the park management, to try and find harmony between these stakeholders, which I think we can all appreciate. Trying to get everyone to agree on things is not the easiest of challenges. And then a really important issue, especially in South Africa and in all developing countries, as well as not, Canada and Australia, for example, are issues of social injustices. So a lot of protected areas and marine protected areas are associated with social injustices, or whether historical or current. And so part of the role of an MPA is, well, to exist, they need the support of the community, but they also, and it's a lot, including in South Africa, it's mandated, I think, in the Protected Areas Act, where you're supposed to help empower, it's not in such words, but you're supposed to help empower the communities and support their livelihoods as well. So, you know, you've got to really try and address those social injustices in a carefully thought out way. And then there's a more conceptual challenge that I feel underlines a lot of MPA and marine-based challenges, and that is the radically open and 3D and dynamic nature of the ocean itself. So I had hoped to give you a physical demonstration and get you guys away from the presentation for a bit, but I couldn't get the angles right, so here are my very carefully made slides instead. So when we think of protected areas, both terrestrial and marine, we think of boundaries. And when we think of boundaries, we tend to think fencing, or at least I do. So in terrestrial protected areas, we can put up physical fences. And this tends to keep the animals and plants within a given space. And it is relatively easier to manage the resources and understand and predict some of the movements. So like our giraffe might move across the park to a tree with more leaves, and the lions might move around. And if you're in Nairobi, they might escape every now and then. So basically terrestrial, you can put up a fence. I'm not saying it's easy, I'm just saying it's different. But we can't put up fences in the ocean. So the fences or the boundaries are conceptual rather than concrete. And this means that there's no way to stop certain species coming in or going out and at certain times. So as much as we would like to protect, say, the baby turtles, we are limited in what we can do. and their feeding areas tend to be temporally and spatially unpredictable. So it's really a challenge to try and come up and decide on areas that need to be protected that will have the right sort of benefits that we want. So that's challenge number one. They are radically open. Challenge number two is the dynamic nature of the ocean. So in the ocean, we have eddies and currents, and the whole sort of system moves all over the world, and it's really amazing. And it's essential for the survival of not only the marine system, but also the planetary system. But this does also mean that when it comes to managing a protected area, it's a bit more difficult. Again, because we can't control what's coming in, and things from great distances or different habitats, like invasive alien species, can come in. And they can be brought in by human activity. Or another example that's very visual, and it's a bit of a buzz topic, is marine plastic pollution. So there have been times when I've been sitting on the beach in Kenya or South Africa or wherever, and there has been a piece of plastic or rubbish that has washed up from literally the other side of the world. And that is just gives you an idea of how dynamic, how it's constantly moving. And so it's a real reminder that everything is connected, and that can be a really good thing, and it can also be a challenge. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about marine plastics anymore because that's a whole topic in itself. So I'll let that just linger. And then the third major challenge is the 3D nature of the ocean. So in a terrestrial park, you maybe mainly have to focus on what's on the surface, what you can see, and generally it's one sort of ecosystem type. Whereas in the ocean, you're not only worried about things changing as you move horizontally and move further and further out to sea, but you're also worrying about what happens at different depths, and the impacts of certain things can have different properties, so emergent properties, as you go further down. So what happens at the sea floor will probably have an impact further up at some point because of the vertical connections, but it might not be the same. So being able to try and understand that with it being open and dynamic, and now you've got to add in these different layers, it's a lot to think about. So that is the major conceptual challenge to me, the radically open, dynamic, and 3D nature of the ocean. And I came up with this analogy, and I was really proud of it. And it's basically trying to manage the ocean is like trying to look after a teething puppy. You can't just put it in the corner to sleep while you go off and have cocktails with your family. In reality, you have to be constantly on your toes, looking out for chewable items, or in the case of marine areas, different interactions and threats. So people who are managing protected areas or working in them, they've got a lot going on and they're really stressed. So I feel like we should just be nice to park managers and be nice to the ocean, and we can then have our cocktails. So I am getting towards the end, I think, and I'd now like to just give you some of the more interesting ways of managing MPAs or designing MPAs to demonstrate how we can overcome some of the challenges that I've mentioned. So one of the challenges is the 3D open dynamic nature of the ocean. And one of the solutions to this problem has been make it bigger. So we have large offshore MPAs, so LMPAs, which they have the capacity to protect a greater amount of diversity, larger habitats, potentially entire trophic webs and ecological processes. And as well as pelagic habitats, the offshore MPAs can also protect deep sea benthic and demersal ecosystems, so the ocean floor and the bit above. So it can help protect these ecosystems that are closely linked to the entire vertical pelagic realm above them. But these two ecosystems tend to remain quite poorly understood and are at risk of activities such as trawling and oil and mining, exploration and sea dumping. So they're at risk, but we don't know what the impacts are. So if we can protect as much as possible, that would be great. So protecting entire bioregions can preserve the horizontal and vertical pathways and connectivity without the need for the more sort of complex conservation planning that's usually needed for smaller MPA networks. Another way of, or type of MPA that can hopefully address some of the social injustices as well as empowering communities is having community-based MPAs. And the novelty of CB MPAs is that they are generally community established, community implemented, and they can show great signs of success. And it's really a testament in those cases of success to community empowerment and ownership, which often then leads to sustainability in the long run. And in some cases, results in a system that needs little to no outside assistance. And from a government's perspective, these types of MPAs can be really great because governments often don't have the financial and the human resources to directly assist with resource management at a site scale for an entire country. So these community-based MPAs can potentially take off some of the pressure. You can also get locally managed and marine areas. So these are of a similar concept, but they aren't necessarily technically marine protected areas. Then this is an example of CB MPAs. And I learned about these at a conference last year, and I just found it really interesting. And I've been dying to share it with people, so you're my chosen audience. So MPA establishment in Fiji has been going on for a long time by local communities, that is, establishment by local communities has been going on for a really, really long time. And it's often been part of cultural practices, one of which is a cultural practice of Indigenous Fijian communities for their funerals. So in some parts of Fiji, what they do is small portions of reef or river are protected after a loved one has been buried. And these protected areas are called funerary, which is a very hard word to say, funerary MPAs, and are always established for 100 nights. And during that 100 nights, nothing can be harvested from that area. So it's a great time for recovery potentially. And this is the example of a temporary and a rotating MPA. So it's not necessarily in the same area, and obviously it's only got 100 nights. And the 100 nights starts, so the count of the 100 nights starts from the day of the burial. And then at the end of that 100 nights, the communities will get together and they will harvest the FMPA. And the catch is then used as a feast to celebrate the end of that period, and also to celebrate that person's life. So these are really MPAs that really speak to people's cultural and spiritual needs as well. And they have also been associated with great rises in abundance of different of fish populations. So it was reported that in one at one such feast, there was actually 700 kilos of fish were harvested from that area. So when they harvest, they really harvest. So after all of this, the main question is, why MPAs? What are the benefits? What are we doing it for? And I feel like we've already talked about quite a few of the benefits indirectly, and a lot of them are linked to the high biodiversity, the livelihood support, the job creation, the well-being, the food, the medicine. They're great platforms for education, as well as disaster risk reduction and addressing climate change, which will probably need to be a whole other topic again. So really, MPAs speak to lots of the different sustainable development goals, not just life underwater, but also of no poverty and no hunger. Again, I did think about aligning the sustainable development goals throughout this presentation, but honestly, I think that needs to be another conversation again. But one of the main benefits that I would like to end on is the idea of spillover effects. So you'll remember I spoke about the whole radically open and dynamic and 3D nature of the ocean also being a good thing. And that's because it allows for these things called spillover effects, which basically means that the benefits from the MPA, so say increased breeding or spawning or protection over that vulnerable life stage, will have improved hopefully the population of a species and or the recovery of the habitat. And because it's open and dynamic and there aren't any fences, these benefits can then spread beyond the boundaries of the MPA. So basically, the ocean, our little naughty puppy, really likes to share the good things too. And you don't actually need to be near an MPA to benefit from it. So that's, to me, that's also one of the great reasons for MPAs. So that's what I have to say about MPAs. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about, and I really have skimmed over a lot. And you know, MPAs aren't the silver bullet. They aren't the solution to everything. And I know that this presentation has been very positive and great and yay MPAs, because there's a lot of good to do with them. And you know, I think we've got enough bad going on in the world that we don't need a miserable presentation. But I would really like to keep this conversation going. I think we have a lot to learn from each other, and it's just a great platform, and there are people here that may never have met in any other circumstances. So I have put together a sort of conversation board on an online platform called Padlet. So on it, it's open to the public, so you can share the link with other people as well. And it's basically there for us to share ideas, projects, opportunities, to ask questions, and then also for you to comment and engage with other people. So you don't have to look at it now. Obviously, you can scan the QR code if you haven't already. I'm going to take it away now. And I'm just going to show you how to use Padlet. So the link or the QR code will bring you to this page. And all you have to do is, if you're on a computer, you just double click and a thing will come up, and you can please type your name if you would like to. It would be great to know who you are. So you would type your name here, and then you would write whatever you want here. You can add photos, anything like that. And then if you don't have it on your laptop, you can also just on your phone come to the plus and add here, and you can add files, you can add whatever you want. This platform is going to be unmoderated, so please just be respectful in any posts and comments. I don't think I'll be able to moderate it. If I'm being honest, I will try. But if it doesn't work, I will unfortunately have to remove the resource. And this is obviously also just a starting resource that hopefully then people can move forward from. So thank you. I'm going to stop screen sharing now. And I hope that you guys enjoyed that. And
thank you. Oh, sorry, you carry on.
No, I was just going to say I'm hopefully ready for questions if there are any.
We have unfortunately run out of time.
Sorry, guys.
But we have been keeping tabs of the chat box, and we've had a couple of awesome questions come through. So Shannon, what I am going to do is I'm going to send these questions to you, and usually what we do with the webinars is we will, as I've explained before to you, we'll send you the questions, and then you could send us the answers, or put it into a nice document and send it to everybody who was part of the webinar today.